This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under-18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode number 550 for March 4th, 2018. Coming up on today's show, Ask a Poly Lawyer. That's coming up on today's episode. Hello everybody, this is Lusty Guy, today's stand-in host for Cunning Minx. Now, our girl's fine, don't get worried or anything. She just had a little medical procedure here in these last couple days and she's a little tired. So, being how I'm all Mr. Helpful, I thought that I would volunteer and do the easy part of the show because I am, in fact, Mr. Helpful and the easy part is my favorite part. So welcome to episode number 550. We've got a little bit of announcements and host chat, and then right into a great subject, Ask a Poly Lawyer. So, in terms of announcement, the University of Utah has got a Relationship Decision Lab study out. There's a link in our show notes. And please give them a little help if you can, and here's a bit of audio from them on that very topic.
Are you planning on opening up your relationship? The University of Utah Relationship Decisions Lab is looking for participants in monogamous relationships who are currently considering opening up their relationship to take a survey. We are looking for individuals who have never opened up and individuals who have opened up in the past but are currently with one partner and are planning on opening up again. This study will examine how people choose to open their relationships and what their experiences of this relationship transition look like. If you or anyone you know fits our qualifications, we invite you to take our survey. You can find our survey at www.relationshipdecisions.org. Once there, click on the Participants tab and then on the Open Relationship Project link. Not only will you be furthering science, but you will be entered to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Again, the link is www.relationshipdecisions.org. Click on the Participants tab and the Open Relationship Project link.
And secondarily, in host chat, we wanted to let you all know that Cunning Minx and I will be at the Southwest Love Fest, a conference on ethical non-monogamy in Tucson, Arizona, April 6th through the 8th. So we're really looking forward to it. It's going to be nice to get some sunshine. Come on over and say hello to us while you're there. And so, without any further ado, let's get into the main part of our show with our Ask a Poly Lawyer with Benjamin Shenker.
I am thrilled to welcome to the Poly Weekly studios for the very first time, Ben Shenker, a poly legal expert. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you for having me. I know it's been a while for us trying to get this together, but I'm very, very glad to be here.
We have had so many reschedules, usually on my end, so thank you so much for your patience, and I'm so excited that you're finally here.
Me too, and I think that most of your listeners would know that patience is really important for poly people, so I'm glad that at the very least it's given me an opportunity to exercise that skill.
There you go. And now, Ben, would you care to introduce yourself to our Poly Weekly audience? Who are you? What do you do?
Well, like you said, my name is Ben Shenker. I am an attorney. I am licensed in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. My practice focuses on non-traditional families, including polyfamilies, kinksters, GSMs, LGBTQIA, and the rest of the rainbow. So sorry if I've excluded anyone. I use a variety of tools from family law and estate planning and contracts to try and make sure that no matter what the composition of your family, you can have as much or as little legal protections as you want and are as possible. And just to make sure I get this out of the way, I'm sure you've heard this a billion times. This is not intended as legal advice, and this is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship. And if you have any serious legal questions, you should always consult a licensed attorney in your state, commonwealth, or district.
So there are a number of questions that do arise in terms of polyamory, and there are a couple that come up very frequently. I put out a call on Facebook and Twitter, and the question that I always have is one that C.A. Sizemore asked, which is, besides an LLC, is there an easy way for 3 or more people to own real property like cars, land, investments, etc.?
Yes, actually, there are a number of ways that you can do this. LLCs are actually kind of a new thing, legally speaking. I mean, it's not something that happened yesterday, but it's definitely something that has only existed since the creation of the United States. Laws go back several hundred years. You can own things in an LLC or a partnership or a corporation. You can also have a trust. Trusts can actually be much more simple than people would think. Another way to do it is just on the title of the property ownership itself, like a deed to a house. You can say co-owned by A, B, C, D, E, etc., etc. When you're doing that, it's called a tenancy in common, and there are a couple of different types of that. Some of that can be useful for estate planning purposes. But the simple answer is yes, there are a number of ways for a polycule or a triad or, just a couple, however you want to go, to own a piece of property.
Can I ask you to maybe walk us through a brief definition of those things that you mentioned? What's the difference between a trust, a corporation, and an LLC? And I think you mentioned one other.
I think it would have been a partnership.
Yes.
Okay. A corporation is a legal entity. It's actually for a lot of purposes, a person. If you remember the case, Citizens United.
I do.
Yes. It's a legal person. To create that, you would register with your state's Department of State, generally, and pay a fee. And then, following that, when you run a business and somebody wants to sue you, they can't necessarily get at your personal assets. There are exceptions and caveats. An LLC is very similar. It's a limited liability company, and you register with your Secretary of State, and the same sort of thing happens. And the differences can be maybe that you incorporate a corporation, but you organize an LLC. Now, a partnership is any sort of business where there are more than one owner. A partnership doesn't necessarily have to be 2 people. You can have 2 people, 3 people, 1,000 people. There are such things as limited liability partnerships where you set it up, and as long as you follow the formalities and somebody sues the business, they can only get at the business's assets and not yours. A trust is a document, and it can also be a legal person, especially for tax purposes. With a trust, you have someone who gives the property to the trust. That's called the grantor. The person who gets the property is the trustee, and that person has legal ownership of the property, but they hold it for the benefit of a beneficiary. So you give property to a trustee who holds it for the benefit of a third party. So, for example, if you have kids and you have a rich uncle who wants to leave them property, give them property, that's fine. The kids can own it, but the kids can't necessarily invest it or sell it. So you would have, I think it's called a trust for that purpose.
How would a trust work in terms of poly? It seems like an LLC or corporation, especially since both of those can legally can be treated like people, basically, and get a lot of the same rights as, human people. And then presumably you would list, I don't know, do the people involved in those corporations or LLCs then become like the board of directors? How do you show sort of equal or whatever percentage of ownership is for the people involved in the corporation or LLC?
Well, when you have a corporation or an LLC, like I said, you have to register with the Secretary of State for your state. And you have to write up your bylaws and other incorporation documents. You have to have board members, etc., etc. With a trust, that is a private arrangement. You don't need to go necessarily to a courthouse to do that, and you might not unless there is a problem, like somebody is not doing what they're supposed to do. Now, the thing to remember, because my original background was tax law, so I'm very interested in taxes. All of these things, corporations, LLCs, partnerships, trusts, they are legal persons and they have to pay taxes. So if you have an LLC and it's owned by more than one person, then you have to do partnership accounting for the income of the LLC, which is a partnership for tax purposes. For a corporation, same thing. And for a trust, if the trust is making money, then you have to do that too. But a big thing to remember, a trust can be purely private. You don't need to go and register it anywhere.
What type of poly instance would be a good candidate for a trust? It sounds like someone has to already own something of value. It sounds like it's more about inheritance rather than taking 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 people and having them sort of co-own something. What instance or what situation would a trust apply to in a poly situation?
Well, here's one. The easy way to think about it is cohabitation rights. I know in Washington state, there is a pretty well-defined law for cohabitation rights. The reason those are important is because when you have two people who are living together and not married, and I'm going to stick with two for this purpose, when the relationship ends, as all relationships do, either by breaking up or by death, there is not necessarily any guarantee of the other person being protected. They have developed what's called cohabitation agreements. Now, problem with cohabitation agreements is that they generally are designed for two people. For example, I believe in Minnesota, when you have two cohabitants, you can have an agreement, but if one of the people is married or in another cohabitation agreement, it's not good. So in that case, instead of dealing with a cohabitation agreement, which is tricky in its own right, you could have a trust. And what you could say is, we recognize that we are A, B, and C. And A and B both have jobs. C does not have a job, but we recognize that C's contributions to our family are valuable, and to protect her, we want to assign X percentage of the interest of our income. Because when you have a cohabitation agreement, that's bound by contract law. And in contract law, you have to have exchanges of promises, and they have to be worth something.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. I'm just thinking, wow, that sounds an awful lot like poly rules. But these, if you break these rules, then you can actually get a lawyer involved, not just hurt feelings.
Yes, it's really interesting because I was giving a presentation to a group of Kingsters in D.C., and I mentioned cohabitation agreements. Especially these Kingsters were all very well versed with poly. I believe that most of them were in a polycule. They hadn't heard of this, and they thought it was more like an agreement like on The Big Bang Theory, where it's, you have to go to the bathroom at a certain time.
Yes, not a roommate agreement.
Thank you. That's what I was trying to come up with. I can't watch that show because Sheldon reminds me how pedantic and know-it-all-y I can be.
Well, we all need to be able to laugh at ourselves. And I actually, we've had some other questions come in through social media. So the first one is from Mary, who said, I'm divorced. My ex-husband has remarried, and they are now monogamous. I have one long-term partner of 3 years who is married, presumably not to her. Am I at risk of losing custody of my girls to his more quote-unquote traditional arrangement?
I can see, and you're being very helpful, and you are sending me texts of the questions as you're getting them, and I appreciate that. So I'm going to say that Mary has an ex-husband, let's call him E, and then she has a long-term partner, L. So the question is, so the kids are Mary's and her ex's. I'm assuming that when she says his more traditional arrangement, she means the ex.
The ex who is now remarried, presumably monogamously.
This is a good question. It's really interesting because, like I said, you can have cohabitation agreements and you can have trust agreements, and those things can all be private. When you try and make arrangements with kids, it's really hard because the state can always modify custody. The state has the right and the obligation to take care of children. So the short answer is yes with an if.
Yeah, you're at risk, right?
Long answer is no with a but.
And
I'm stealing that from The Simpsons. They can always move that. If there is a custody agreement, the other person can move to modify it, generally. And a lot of times the question is there been a material change in circumstances? But just because somebody is, doing something that's not savory, for a judge, doesn't necessarily mean that is bad for the kids. People do all sorts of crazy stuff and are still kids.
Right. It kind of depends on the judge in my experience. If your judge has been cheated on, then yeah, you might lose custody, right? It really kind of depends on the personal affiliations of the judge, because there's not a strong legal argument, right, for what is a healthier for kids, right?
I mean, even that depends. In some states, there is a long list of factors that are to be considered in determining the child's best interests, which is the last question that you have to ask when you decide who gets custody. And then some states don't have them, but it's been developed. So it can depend on the judge. And then, if there's an appeal, they'll look at it and you can say, no, this isn't fair. You're using this against me. But you have to remember that I know that a lot of people are concerned about Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services, are staffed by generally professional social worker type people. B, they are underfunded, so they are trying to find the most important things. So, people will call CPS for all sorts of reasons. If they think, oh, my ex is giving my kid too much sugary cereal,
they're not going to probably make a call on that one.
Well, I'm sure it might be if you're in Beverly Hills or something like that. I think that generally your ex, if he's vindictive, could try and modify them. But at least from what I've seen, I don't think that would be enough. Again, where I practice, in D.C., for example, all of the judges are appointed by the president. So they are pretty darn good.
By our current president?
Well, by whoever is the president now. I don't think that any D.C. judges have been appointed by...
Okay.
I mean, it might happen. And I also practice in a very affluent county in Maryland. And I know that some people might live in a place where there are elected judges. So it really depends.
And I have seen it happen. I have friends that they were poly with somebody. They break up. The poly person goes and finds someone else to marry and says, we're monogamous now, not like that immoral poly person, give me the kids. And it's like, wait, you were poly 5 freaking minutes ago. But they come and say, now I'm monogamous, and they will, on a kid, if the judge is inclined, they'll get the kids. But at any rate, I wanted to move forward to another question, which I thought was kind of interesting. This is from Twitter, from Sexland Podcast, who asked, is claiming a second legal marriage the only way to get prosecuted for polygamy? Is there anything short of that poly families need to avoid or steer clear of to avoid legal polygamy issues?
That is something that I've heard a lot about. I know that people have talked about having common law marriage and saying that you can get in trouble for bigamy for that. The thing is, I've heard it from people who are not practicing in a place where common law marriage exists. Common law marriage is not very widespread, but it happens to be enforced in the District of Columbia. To do that, you would have to call your partner your spouse, not just say, this is my partner, this is my lover, this is my friend, etc.
Right. One aspect of common law marriage is you have to actually publicly say, we are married, we are together.
Right. Exactly. But not just say we're together. You have to say that they're your spouse.
We are married, this is my husband, wife, spouse.
Exactly.
Yes.
But the other thing to consider about that is that when there is a multiple marriage, the second marriage, at the top of my head, I believe it's called void ab initio, which means it's void from the beginning. So I don't see how you could actually have a second marriage if you try and do it, and you can maybe trick a clerk, and that could do it. But I just wanted to say one other thing that might be a possible legal pitfall is that in some states, adultery is a crime. In Maryland, I know it's a crime. It's a $15 fine, but it's a crime nonetheless.
Interesting.
Well, the really important thing is that when you're doing a divorce case and somebody asks about that, you can then plead the Fifth Amendment and say, I'm not going to answer this because it could put me at risk for criminal prosecution, even though no one prosecutes it.
Oh, our laws are silly.
They sure are.
You know, going back to Sexland podcast question, I don't think there's anybody out there who's really on the warpath to prosecute polygamists. I think the only reason that the folks from Big Love were prosecuted is because they went on TV and said they were married. So they were recorded public statements repeatedly saying that they were married. That's why they had to move and all. But if you just live together quietly and act as married partners and say that you're married partners, well, unless you're like on TV, I don't think the polygamy police are really going to come after you. Kind of like the adultery police, like nobody really cares. It's just that there are certain legal circumstances where it's helpful to be able to either take the fifth or to be able to say, this person admitted to adultery 4 times, therefore I get, more of her money when we're divorcing, that kind of thing.
In a way, but just to clarify, when you say Big Love, you're talking about the fictional show, not other...
Not Big Love, what was the other one? Sister Wives is what it was.
Okay.
The real people.
Yeah, okay. I have not followed either of them. I know that they're apparently both very entertaining.
I watched, I think, an episode of each, but moderately entertaining, I would say.
I know that Utah has some very surprisingly anti-polygamy laws, or that's what I believe I've read.
Yeah. Which is why the folks on that show, Sister Wives, had to move, because they were going on TV publicly saying that they were married and that he was technically a bigamist.
Yeah, it's just so uncommon. Now there is an issue with immigration stuff. If you are married, because there are countries, especially I believe majority Muslim nations, I think can be allow multiple marriages. And the thing is, if you have a multiple marriage in that nation where it's valid, and you come to the United States, it won't be considered valid.
In Canada, it is, but
oh, okay.
I believe that you're right. Yeah, Canada's way more open-minded than we are, but here in the U.S., that's right. If you come from a country where your multiple legal marriages are recognized, you come here, and I guess you have to pick one.
I have not seen it happen aside from a TV show once. So, and then the other thing to remember, though, is that you do not necessarily have to be married to get all the benefits and obligations of marriage. So if that's a concern, there are other ways to deal with that.
Now, we've just got a few minutes left, so let's talk about that. Marriage is the easiest way to get like 5,000 different benefits, and those who can't legally marry have to find other ways to get those benefits. So can you share with us really briefly, what are some of the other ways to get some of the benefits of marriage without actually legally being married?
Sure, I can. And here is my being pedantic again. I think someone actually did this study before DOMA, and it's 1,100 legal, or it's mentioned in the U.S. Code 1,100 times. So you're exactly right. There are a ton of benefits that you can get being married. And sorry to be a know-it-all.
Hey, you're here to be a know-it-all, so.
Fair enough. There's a thing called contractual marriage, where it's not actually a marriage. Like I said, it's like an agreement that you would have with another person, and you can draft a cohabitation agreement and explain what your obligations and duties are to one another. The trick with that is in certain states, you have to have it written. Certain states just don't accept it. Like I said, I think Minnesota and Texas both have pretty broad coverage of it. But I know the biggest rule is when you do this, you cannot say, I'm trading anything for sex. That's called a meretricious relationship. It's no good.
So I could basically draw up a contract with Lusty Guy or Elle or both, I guess, and say things like, your kids inherit my fortune and I give you healthcare power of attorney. And in places where it's legal, I will put you on my healthcare as a partner. And they could do the same, right? So we could actually put some of these thousands of rights that married people get into a contract. We would just have to be very specific about which rights we want. We have to write everything out as opposed to just saying I do and, having everything automatically apply.
It's quite possible, yes. And you actually just covered a number of things that are important for doing this. Having an advance directive is what in Maryland we call a healthcare power of attorney. But a healthcare power of attorney, living will, advance directive. Yes, and then also if you can help to make sure that these partners, when you're not married, should have some sort of access to you when you're in the hospital. When you say, I'm going to draft a contract that says I'm going to leave, this money. Yeah, you're right. But there's another step in that where you actually have to draw the will up and say, I'm going to leave this person this money. And you can have a contract to make sure
yes,
that you can't change it. And you mentioned another one that's really important, which is designated beneficiaries. When available, you can just say, oh, I want my insurance proceeds to be paid to Minx or to LG. That's another option to do.
Yeah, like I have listed for my life insurance, I have listed Lusty Guy as my beneficiary, but that's a one-off thing, right? So, I do have a separate will, where I basically leave my estate to Lusty Guy and Elle. But so I guess we'd still need a document to cover these other issues. And I do need to do but here we call a healthcare power of attorney, and which you call, I guess, an advance directive. I think I still need to do that. Working on that. That's next.
I'm glad you mentioned these things because I'm actually in the process of, it's been launched by now, interactive feature on my website, polyamory.law, where you can answer a few questions about yourself and your family. And then it will explain why you need some of these documents: a power of attorney, a living will, healthcare power of attorney, will, possibly a trust, and parenting plans for people who have kids. Another big thing to know is when you are not in a cis opposite sex relationship, is that powers of attorney and healthcare powers of attorney, in my opinion, can be really helpful because with the religious freedom laws that we've been having of late, or passing of late, like the cake case in Colorado, there are a lot of people who say, I object to gay marriage. It's not reasonable. My religious beliefs don't allow me to recognize it. It's really hard to make that similar argument when it's, my religious rights don't believe in healthcare powers of attorney. I don't see how that's a good argument.
Yeah, it's a nice backup. Ben, this has been so helpful. So we can find that interactive site at polyamory.law. Where else can people find you online?
My Twitter handle is polyamory.lawyer. I am on Facebook. There it is, the law office of Benjamin Shenker. I had to go really fancy and official and vanilla for that one. Hopefully you should be able to find me. A great site, especially for people who have been concerned about child custody arrangements. Search for the National Coalition of Sexual Freedom, or for Sexual Freedom, and they have a kink-aware professional list, and there are some poly-aware professional lists on other site. But whenever you have a concern about your kids, NCSF is a great resource, and I work with them. Then hopefully, if you want to see me in person, then I am usually around H Street in Northeast D.C., which has really good food.
Awesome. In person. That's just crazy. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions.
Oh, the reason I went to school is to learn things so I can help the community. So I really appreciate you letting me share all of this with you. So thank you for your time.
And if you have any questions, you can find him at polyamory.law or any of the other places that we just mentioned online. Thanks again, Ben.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Well, thank you very much, Benjamin, for making yourself available for that interview. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned a little something. Thanks also to our Poly Weekly Playmates for their generous donations this and every week. Poly Weekly is a free resource that has helped hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to polyamory. These donations keep this podcast free for everyone, both inside and outside the community. For booking and business considerations, email me at lustyguy@polyweekly.com. For advice and general feedback, email cunningminx@gmail.com. You can also reach us at 802-505-POLY. And remember, it's not all about the sex.